All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the July meeting of ICODR. Very excited to see all of you here. There is so much going on. It's very, very difficult to keep track. I'm sure all of you are reeling from the almost daily revelations about how much the plates are shifting under the fields. And a lot of it is due to artificial intelligence, machine learning. I don't know if you saw, I think it was Jus Mundi just released a new AI-powered arbitrator assistant tool, and it's using LLMs to do, really, it looks like it's doing document summary. Actually, I think, Amy, you have a preview, so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it. But I think there are many, many more things to come soon, and I'm delighted that our good friend Bob has agreed to share some of the latest work that he's been doing. So Bob, let me hand it over to you, and you can kick us off, and and then we
Sure.
can have a wider conversation after you show us some of what you've achieved.
All right. So let me share my screen first of all. Let me. This always. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about support bots today. Last presentations I did were showing how the software can generate questions depending on the dispute, and can also analyze people's priorities and maybe make some suggestions for how to resolve the dispute. Today, then we added a support bot so that people could learn to use the software whenever there was a question you could ask the bot. Now, what's interesting is that the history of bots is kind of long. I can remember back when I was at MIT in 1966 playing with Elijah, which was written by Weizenbaum, and kind of mimicked the Rogerian psychotherapist, basically. It played off of a script. And, Rogerian psychotherapy is kind of turned every answer into a new question, basically. So, I don't feel good today, then why do you not feel good today, or something like that. The next was Parry, which was constructed by Kenneth Colby in 1972, and it kind of imitated kind of schizophrenic patients. And then you can see we've kind of gone through Sabetso, which was done on MS-DOS, and there's a whole history of basically trying to mimic humans with computer software, back to when Turing, Alan Turing, gave the first Turing test, basically, to see if you could tell the difference between a computer and a human. And now we've kind of, migrated to these bigger open language models like OpenAI and Palm 2, which has just come out. I think Google announced Palm 2 last week. And Meta has the Lambda model, and there's a number of these coming out almost every week. However, we still have the problem that we don't know how to regulate these things, and we still have lots of questions about ethics, about using this kind of technology. In any case, it was very clear that given we're a kind of a small size company, that we could provide support by using a bot. And then we went through this kind of effort to decide on first what the requirements of a support bot would have to be. And of course, it would have to be available 7x24, independent of time zone, which of course isn't too hard since it's a piece of software. It had to be trained to provide general help with the software as well as mediation questions. It would have to help mediators navigate the platform, basically, and also be able to resolve problems in a way that didn't involve human intervention. And so when we tried to kind of characterize the requirements, we came up with the following. It had to be user-friendly, had to have problem-solving capabilities, the knowledge base, which is considered in these kind of AI tools, long-term memory training. It had to be able to learn from.
Quería escuchar esto de inteligencia artificial.
I didn't hear the question.
No, it wasn't a question, Bob. It's just
Oh.
I muted Alberto. Please keep going.
Oh, okay. Natural language processing. So that made up the kind of user friendliness, and had to be scalable, meaning it had to handle multiple questions at the same time from different users and be able to grow with the business. And then, of course, had to have this aspect of self-service availability. In other words, if there were issues that it couldn't solve, or they were actually bugged in the software, it had to point the user to some kind of self-service problem ticket creation. And so those were kind of the general requirements of a support bot, technical support bot. Now, the advantage of these things, and this kind of summary of the previous slide, is that if you look at today's support environment, a lot of times when you call support or customer support, you'll get teleoperators in the Philippines or China or India, depending on the time of day you call. These organizations cost companies a lot of money, and they basically work off a script. And so because they work off a script, they can be trained and automated to some degree. And this would make them available 7/24 and hopefully give consistent response. Part of the problems that have to be solved is that when you're using large language models for creating things like embeddings and vectors, they tend to be non-deterministic. And that's not a good quality for a technical support bot, meaning that when you ask a technical question, you want to get consistently the same answer. You don't want to get 4 or 5 different answers when you're looking for support. And so the problem with the large language models is they can be non-deterministic, and you don't always get the same thing. And so it took some amount of time to train them to give relatively the same answers each time. And again, these tend to be very cost effective if you can get them to work, because they can reduce the need for large customer support teams, and it can save companies quite a bit of money. So, but they're not so easy to build. And I'm going to give you, the next slide is kind of an architecture that's kind of generic, and I'll explain it. And then we'll go do a little demonstration of the bot. So you have a user interface, which again, has to be friendly, and as input has to take natural language. Then below the user interface, there are a couple of things. There are long-term semantic memory, which is basically how you train the bot on your particular details of the software you're trying to train it with, or something like that. There's short-term semantic memory, which is kind of the history of the previous conversations. Because when you're conversing with a bot or anybody else, you want to be able to say, oh, the last answer you gave me wasn't that great. How about giving me more detailed version of it, or something like that? And so there has to be a working memory that's being trained based on other answers. Then when you use large language models, as we've talked about before, you can get lots of toxic results if you're not careful. There's lots of hallucinations, things that are made up. So you need a response manager. The response manager kind of takes the outputs of some of the models and then makes sure that it's not providing you with completely wrong answers. And that you need that when you interface to large language models. You can't just directly interface to them. The prompt manager helps to figure out what the intent of the original question was. And that sometimes takes a couple of passes to a large language model to get the real intent of the question. And with the help of an evaluation module, you can capture the intent of the questions. And so the orchestrator kind of controls all the pieces and knows when to use which piece. So the I guess the thing to take away from this is that when you're trying to build these bots or support things or applications that are going to use large language models, you cannot directly interface the large language models. You need lots of other pieces so that you can control the response, make sure you're asking the right questions, and controlling it so it's not going off into some deep space. So that's kind of how we built the thing. And now, if there's any questions, just interrupt. I see there's some things in the kind of chat box.
I've just been posting some links. I don't think there are questions there per se yet, but you can charge ahead with the demo if you want. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask Bob about the architecture before we get into the demo? Okay, I don't see any questions, Bob. So let's charge ahead.
Okay, so let's see if we can actually. All right, so let me. All right, now the typical response is going to take roughly 40 seconds. You don't really want it to be more than 20, 25, but because we had to implement a lot of filtering, we had to make several passes to the models in order to get a reasonable response. And so each time you ask a question, it will take a little bit of time, so you have to have a little bit of patience. So here's our normal interface, the different kinds of dashboards and things you're doing. And this little guy here is the support bot. And so the support bot's available on any page. And so you can say, whatever, what's a good, okay, give me a detailed list of instructions for creating a mediation in the software. Okay, and so, like I said, this is about a 40-second response.
And that's a long time, 40 seconds. I mean, I know you're doing multiple passes because you showed us the architecture, so you're ensuring for quality.
Yes.
But I just think about from a usability perspective, most users are not going to wait. You'd have to give them some other cue. We're waiting for a customer service rep to help you out. Please, someone will be joining your chat soon.
Yes.
There need to be some way of managing that delay. Or
yes.
We need to find a way to accelerate that to make it really usable.
Yeah, so at the moment where we are looking at different ways to make it faster. Okay, so that's, okay, so right now what it did was summarize the instructions, right? And so it's just giving you a bunch of simple things, okay? And then you can say, okay, please list all the instructions for creating. So you want to keep the conversation going. And, these things take a little bit of time to get the context of what you're trying to do. And like I said, because you're using kind of language stuff, it takes a couple passes to get to the intent. And otherwise, because words tend to be overloaded when you're training it, for instance, you can use the word mediation in a number of different contexts. And then what you don't want it to do is go ahead and give you a lot of misinformation. And that, so first it might summarize, how you started, right? And then it'll go give you, in this case, okay, here's a list of all the instructions, right, for creating.
So Bob, walk us through what's happening on the back end while those dots are going. So you showed us the schematic before, essentially, of how it operates, but
right.
So you've obviously the LLM you're using, presumably if it's ChatGPT or Bard or another one, you've trained that LLM on the instructions for your site. How did you get that information into?
Okay. All right. So the way you get the information is before you actually go out to the LLM. So the training part is you have a separate database
Mhm.
of embeddings. Okay. An embedding is basically just the word within a context. So you're storing a word and its meaning at the same time. And the way they do this is the embedding essentially converts a snippet of tokens or data or words, let's just say a whole sentence,
Mhm.
and converts it into a vector, which basically is a series of numbers which shows the probability of it showing up in different parts of a sentence or paragraph. All right.
Okay.
And then these are all stored. So first thing you do is take all your documentation
Mhm.
and you convert it to these embeddings and you store it in a vector database. That's the long-term memory
Mhm.
specific to your stuff. Then there's another database, which is the working memory. And basically, that's the current conversations you're having.
Mhm.
And that's taking the embeddings and storing it in another database to see if uh, before you send anything out to the large language models, if there's something in the current working conversations or something in the long-term memory that is relevant to the answer, okay, or
Mhm.
close in proximity to the answer. And once you have all those little snippets of stuff, then you can also go out to the large language model and then go get some more information. And then basically it takes all of that stuff and depending on the prompt, figures out what the answer is.
Got it.
So you want it to go to your memory first
Mhm.
before you go to the large language model memory, is the
Okay.
basic idea. Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So, and that's why it takes time because there's a lot of traffic. So in this case, we asked for instructions and it gave you a list of instructions. Well, we can also say things like, okay, my client doesn't want to register on the system. Uh, can I still use the software to help mediate? So this is kind of the problem solving part of it. So you can ask a variety of questions
Mhm.
and then it tries to understand the intent and then come up with a reasonable solution to the problem, right? And
Mhm.
so like I said, this takes longer than we want it to, but we'll eventually be able to speed it up. It's
Sure.
just getting it functionality first, and
So
then yeah.
while we're waiting for the response, Bob, let me just ask a question. So how do you know that the responses that the bot provides are quality responses?
Well, that's you because you can put it through another query of context to see
Mhm.
if the words are within the realm of the things you're looking at, the keywords, right?
Okay.
So
So you could have a
here,
set of test questions that cover most of the bases that you want to cover in your support system, and you can run all those through this bot and see what responses it provides,
right,
and ensure that they're quality, right?
right. So here's an example. Okay, you can still use the software, but use alternate means like email or phone manual input responses, right? So
Hmm.
that's a reasonable answer, right? Let's say my clients are very angry and do not want to mediate, whatever. And again, this is basically um, not only instructional, but then tries to provide general solutions to mediation problems, right?
Mm.
And so that's why uh, it takes a bit of time to get this stuff to work right. And not giving you bizarre answers to
Well,
issues.
Bob, I'm going to tip my cards here. A support bot is very helpful, and I think lots and lots and lots of businesses are going to deploy LLMs, chat LLMs in a mechanism like this. But the whole time you're showing this, I'm thinking, could we create a mediator bot using this same technology? You know,
Uh, Probably.
so I mean, we're going to loop back and talk about that all together, I'm sure. But You know, obviously a mediator does more than just looking up in the long-term memory to figure out, okay, you know, what's the answer to this question? All right, let's see what this answer is. All right, well, that's marginally helpful.
Well,
It's giving some
again,
advice.
this is for the mediator, right? This is
Right.
not
It's
going
advice
to.
for the mediator. Now, you didn't put anything about this. I mean, you can ask a question that you didn't envision when you were educating your long-term memory, and the
Right.
LLM will still make it, you know, try and make sense out of it.
Right.
Because this is not specific to next level mediation. My clients are angry and do not want to mediate. That, I mean, it's
Right.
relevant to any
Exactly.
mediator. Yeah.
Right. So this is more generic about mediation, right?
Yeah.
And so, and then there are, you know, there is specific problems left in terms of using the software or something like that. And so, first you look in your own training, and there are the current conversations, and then you go out to the large language models, but you also have to kind of filter the responses so that they're, and so that's kind of the whole approach to doing this stuff.
So if you were to say something that you definitely don't have in your database about, you know, what are some reasons why mediation is a bad option for parties? Like clearly you wouldn't put that in your database. The LLM that you go out to would still respond,
All right.
right? I mean, you've got the full power of ChatGPT here. So I mean, it could say something, you know, what are some ways to thwart a mediation or ensure that it's not successful? It'll respond to that, right? You don't have any guardrails in place.
No, in fact, I don't know what it's going to. I have no idea what this response is going to
Well,
come back.
therein lies the rub, right? Because the LLM is going to say whatever the LLM says, and without those guardrails, it could
Right,
be.
but the assumption is the guardrail is the mediator. Okay.
Well, that's true, right? So what you're saying is the only the mediator can have this interaction. Like,
Right.
can parties interact with a support bot?
No.
Oh, okay, all right. So that's good. I mean, that is a procedural protection.
Yes, that was the assumption, because you, again, all of the AI stuff requires human oversight, because we don't have clear understanding of
Right.
AI ethics or any of the other stuff. So we're assuming that the mediator will, in fact, do the right thing.
Yeah.
So this is obviously not in there. So
right. Let's see. Well, that's interesting. So it ignored our question,
yes.
and it just decided to spin it positively.
Yeah.
But presumably that's just the LLM trying to always be on the sunny side of life. And that's, I think, what annoys people about some of these LLMs. You know, they really don't want it to give advice about how to build a bomb. So if you say, how do you build a bomb? They say, well, you don't want to build a bomb. Bombs are mean and they hurt people. It's like, okay, well, you didn't answer my question. Well, it's very, I mean, first of all, Bob, this is very, very cool. And I think this takes to the next level some of the AI integration you've already shown us. But what are your what are your thoughts about this? I mean, now that you've experimented with this, you know, obviously there's probably a multi-billion-dollar business to be made writing support bots, and I assume there's lots of startups that are focused on doing this and getting better at it. But you know, what are your takeaways? What do you think the top line should be? You know, for all of us in the ODR fields, are you encouraged about the use of these tools? Are you concerned because you don't really know what they're going to generate? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So as when I first started this, my thoughts are that there has to be human oversight. And in fact, all of the large language models, let's say ChatGPT-4, right? You know, all of the toxic stuff that it generated was filtered out by Kenyan workers, right? Paid $10 an hour or something in Africa, right? So it does require human oversight, because in general, it's not reasoning anything. It doesn't have a concept of physical laws or psychological laws. It doesn't know how to rationally reason things. It's just based on probability of things showing up, right? So until something's developed that does a little more reasoning, then you definitely need a human oversight. Now, for us, the next step would be to add skills to the bot so that you could say things. And we have some examples kind of in development where you can say, okay, write a welcoming letter to XYZ, show it to me before you send it out, and then email it to them. So that it becomes kind of, again, an assistant, right, to do basic stuff that maybe you had a secretary, admin doing that before, but, or for instance, have a dispute of XYZ between party A, party B, create a mediation context for me and generate some questions. And we could do that, right? So that basically all of the detailed work of setting things up can be taken care of in some relatively automatic way, but it still requires a mediator to kind of help resolve the dispute, right? And so I think the next step for us, for instance, would be adding skills so that it can actually not only answer questions, but can actually do things.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So do you have any more demos or slides that you want to show, or should we open this up to a broader conversation?
I would open up to a broader conversation because, I mean, we can ask all kinds of questions, but I think you get the idea that.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is very cool, Bob, and thank you for showing this. Again, you were the first person I ever saw that integrated an LLM AI into an ODR platform, and you're the first ODR platform I've ever seen that's tried to build a support bot using some of these tools and technologies. So thank you for that. But let me just also say, I did put a link in the chat about this Jus Mundi tool. I just read this morning about some mediators that were working in a large multi-party dispute that used ChatGPT in an interesting way. They gathered lots of feedback from all the participants, and they put it in one repository, and then they fed it to an LLM, and they asked the LLM to summarize it and say, you know, what are the key issues in all of this? Because the mediators didn't have time to do it. I think they did it real time in a multi-party session. And then it generated, you know, the summary. These are the key concerns that have been articulated, you know, based on all of this information was gathered from all the parties. So, Bob, you said this at the end. I have a lot of misgivings about using some of this technology in sort of a mediative or an evaluative role, because we don't know what it's going to do. We don't, you know, we can educate it on a certain set of data, as you said, the long-term memory. But even when we're asking questions, like, I don't know, let's see what it says. So, you know, until we can, you know, have a very high degree of certainty that it's going to be doing things that we're comfortable with, I think the odds of putting an AI into a role like that probably are very low. But this idea of having an assistant, an AI assistant, then you can say to the AI assistant, you know, generate a separation agreement with these terms. And you could already have fed it, you know, templates of what your separation agreements look like. Well, that's probably a comfortable use. And as we say, as Tom said, the mediator is the guardrail. The mediator has to evaluate the product from the LLM. The same thing is true, you know, to say, okay, well, here's a lot of input from all the parties. And maybe you could even share this with the parties. Okay, everybody submit your comments. We're going to put it into this. We're going to submit it to the LLM AI and say, summarize what are the top 10 concerns coming out of this. You know, like that's something, again, people may be comfortable with an LLM playing that role because it's not really exerting any decisions. It's just playing kind of this assistant role. And it seems to me like that mode of LLM, that usage of LLM AIs is getting some traction. But I just want to open that up first to you, Bob, and then to others. You know, have you seen other examples of that, or what are your reactions to some of the things that Bob just showed?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way we've been using it, right? So in other words, you can give it a context of a dispute, and I think I showed this last time.
Right.
You can generate a set of questions. Once you gather the answers from all the parties, it will actually summarize all the answers and give you some insights or what are the key attributes of the dispute, okay? And same thing with analyzing people's priorities. It'll look through all the relative weights of people's objectives and then give you some options for that you might want to negotiate or look into further, right? So in all cases, it's either assists or augments the skills of the mediator, but never eliminates the mediator. And I think for anything like mediation or legal industry in general, that we need to have human oversights all the time. It just does not make sense to let it freewheel and try to make a decision on its own. So, I mean, that's why we've kept it in that context. So,
Tom, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I guess it might be relevant. What I used it recently for, not really in a mediation context, but looking at an old document that had a formula about revenue sharing that was ancient, decades old, and we were working with people trying to rewrite that in a fair way. And I took the language and put it into ChatGPT and said, can you write a formula with examples of applying this to this scenario? And it actually created an algebraic formula with, like the old days, A is this, B is this, and then we can use it as a tool, run it through some numbers and see if it works right. So as an assistant, it can be quite helpful. But we needed human intervention, as Bob says, and everybody else agrees, to actually apply that formula to the setting to see if it works right. So I think it can give us a tool to help people a lot, as Colin, as you say, as an assistant. Things we may never have on our own the ability to do, kind of act like a CPA or an accountant.
Sure.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, please, Tim.
A couple of points. One specific, Bob, for you. I noticed on your website you had training advertised previously, and I'm wondering whether you see the bots as completely taking over the training functionality, either in terms of preparatory training, or when people get stuck, they simply go to the bot. Is that a complete replacement for your training service?
That's a good question, because we certainly thought about it. But at the moment, no, because the training also includes submission of assignments and grading of assignments. And we didn't really feel that we wanted to go to that level in a support bot. It wasn't, we could make a special training bot, but right now, I think the current courseware that's out there is probably adequate for that problem.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
Thank you for that. But the more general question, and maybe I'm just behind on my reading on this, but I'm wondering where we've got to in terms of confidentiality. I know there are concerns about, once you put your problem or whatever you're using the ChatGPT assistant for, where does that information go? And thinking of your example, Colin, of the multi-party, the mass views that were fed in there, is there a confidentiality problem there? That's something which I've heard some concerns about.
Yeah. So in our case, we're using Microsoft's version of OpenAI, and so we have an agreement with them. And I think they, after some discussion, we said that we do not want any of the prompts that wind up going out to be used for training data. And so I think that's as close as you're going to get to protecting confidentiality. And now there are lots of regulations going into place in different regions of the world, right, to try to protect against that. But in terms of privacy acts, but guaranteeing it is certainly is difficult. But even without AI, guaranteeing confidentiality is not that easy anyway, because what's confidentiality in one jurisdiction may not be in another, and can be overturned. So within the limits of what you can actually do, I think.
Well, this gets to Susan's question too. She said in the chat, is the LLM educating itself from the mediator's input? And I guess what you're saying, Bob, is you have an agreement with Microsoft that your submissions are not going to be put into, it's just going to give you a result, and then it's going to presumably throw that data away. Now, we need something more than just Microsoft saying, yeah, well, we're not going to do that. But I do think that there is a concern, submitting information to Bard, submitting your information to ChatGPT, if you don't have an agreement like that from your LLM provider, then presumably, yeah, it would educate itself from that input. Now, the other thing I've seen is there are lots and lots of open source LLMs that are being created out there. So it might be that, you could, eventually download some open source LLM and run it on your own box, or maybe Google Cloud or AWS would give you an LLM server that you could spin up, and then it would sequester that data within your particular LLM. But I think that this is something that we're going to need to figure out in the field, because confidentiality is such a top line ethical responsibility in dispute resolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we have a warning when you use the assistant and the questionnaire development and analysis, not to use people's names or anything like that when you are creating the context, for instance. So, but again, there's no guarantees, right? So.
Yeah, and I mean, I could see in like a multi-party context. I posted something about this case that they did in Ohio, where they used ChatGPT to boil down hundreds of pages of answers into, an essential set of, 3 pages and 5 key ideas. It could be that if you do that transparently with the parties and you say, hey, look, we have access to this LLM. Are you okay submitting? I mean, if this is in a public context and all the parties enter into it willfully, then maybe it'd be okay to use one of those services, especially if there's no PII or nothing, nothing compromising in the material that's submitted. But I think if the mediator was to be doing that on the back end and the parties didn't know and they eventually found out, I could see that being a big issue. Yeah. So other comments, questions about this? I do want to, spin this into a broader conversation about what dynamics people are seeing in the marketplace, because I'm hearing a lot of experimentation on a bunch of different fronts, not only in the ODR context. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in legal tech, and then there's other experiments as well, as people push the frontiers of this technology. But any other comments, questions, reactions to what Bob shared? Amy, I see you shared a paper from ICAL talking about reframing, use of GPT for reframing. Do you want to just talk about that for 1 minute? What's interesting about that paper? I think obviously that's a lot of what mediators do, right? As we reframe communications in a case. I don't know if you're in a place where you can talk, Amy. I see your video and audio are off, but. Okay, well, we'll skip over Amy and see if we can get back to her. Susan, you posted something in the chat. Another ethical aspect is distinguishing between the support bot used for technical support within the platform versus the inherent bias of the LM drawing information from the outside, and how the mediator is key in handling that. Do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Well, actually, I wanted Bob to speak to that because there's a difference between how NextLevel Mediation has educated the bot or the LLM within sort of a closed universe versus the other aspect to the use of this chatbot, which is as a support tool, but it goes out into the public internet realm, which clearly has its inherent biases, as we know. And so there's that distinction of utilizing it for technical support versus mediation support by the mediator, in which the mediator still has those ethical duties and the impartiality that they will have to field in a different way because they're going out into the world, bringing in this information. It's a totally different type of handling of the information than the technical support aspect. Bob, how could you speak to that?
Well, again, there's a trade-off. We could kind of confine the bot to just how to use the software, but because you're having a conversation, and we could probably limit it to just specific things about the software, and and anything that was out of that range, not let it go out. But there are lots, what our experience so far is that people interact with it as though it was a person. It only takes a couple of, because you can type anything you want, and because it remembers some of the previous conversations, it'll start asking things that that some of it's in the training database because it's related to mediation, and some of it's outside that context. And so the question was, do you want to limit it, or do you want it to be a little more flexible and come up with some creative stuff? So in the case of, let's say, analyzing questionnaires, you're basically taking input from people who are in dispute, may have emotional things, may have other legal things, and you can't predict what that's going to be. So you can't really train it for every possible human interaction that you're expecting from clients, right? And so if you want to make it useful, you still have to be able to go out to the data. Now, one of the big worries about AI data is that it becomes stale. It's not up to date. The good news about disputes is that it's the same stuff for the last 1,000 years, and humans seem to always argue about the same thing. So it's probably not going to be stale. All right. There may be some new inventions, but the types of arguments people haven't changed really a lot in the last, centuries. And so the kinds of responses it's tricky to find the right balance between, do you want to go out and let it be a little creative versus just stick to what you know? And if you just stick to what you know, it may not be as useful because you can't really control the kinds of inputs you get from, other sources, I guess. And
well, getting to Susan's question, when we do trainings for online mediators, one of the things that I always say is, one of the dilemmas we present is, what if you're mediating with two parties and you get frustrated and you open a browser tab and you type in one of their names and you see, oh, wait, they spent a year in jail for embezzlement. And, they're talking about who's going to get power of attorney for their, ailing parent. And then you didn't know that. They never said that in the room. They never mentioned this. Presumably they know, but you don't even know if they know that about each other. So now you have this piece of information, and how do you deal with that? And I think it's an interesting question from an LLM perspective too. I mean, if the LLM has access to all the information on the internet, I would hate for, to be in a mediation and say, well, I think I should have power of attorney, and have the LLM say, well, but you spent a year in jail for embezzlement. Is that a good idea? And the parties are like, wait, what? There is an argument. And it's interesting because when I do this with commercial mediators and transactional mediators, they often say, don't get any information other than what the parties give you, because it just introduces bias, it introduces concern. But if you do with family mediators, the family mediators say, I always check my parties before I take a case. I always, because they have an obligation around intimate partner violence and domestic violence. So they want to know what they're dealing with. They want to know, who are these people, So I don't think that there's necessarily a clear answer for the human mediator, but to essentially bring an LLM into the room that could see the whole internet, it seems to me the parties, that really changes the dynamic. If there's a chance that the LLM, even if it's not going to say you spent a year in jail, but if it's going to go out and do research and find out that you spent a year in jail, and then tailor what it says to you based on that, if just introducing a glimmer of that possibility in the minds of the parties, I think would be really potentially destructive.
Right. So you still need ethical human filter. I don't see any way around it.
Yeah.
Right now. Anyway.
So Stan, you sent me a private message. I don't know if you intended that to be just for me or for public consumption, but that's an interesting story. I don't know if you'd be willing to share it with everybody.
Sure. Since I'm an experienced mediator and an experienced contract writer, I took how to write national contracts in the late 70s and also in the early 80s. From the New York-based corporation that I worked for, I negotiated national contracts with Fortune 500 companies on behalf of the company I worked for, Continental Ken, which was located in Manhattan. So I asked ChatGPT if mediators can write settlement agreements. And I asked that in a number of different ways, and I'm just paraphrasing that. I don't remember the exact verbiage I used for all of them. And the answer was always no. Only attorneys, only lawyers should write settlement agreements because of their training. And that immediately lets me know that the programmers, the people that wrote their bias into the programming for it to say that, because that's not true. that would mean that Colin, who's not an attorney, me, I'm not an attorney, Daniel Rainey, who's not an attorney, that we shouldn't be allowed to write a settlement agreement. And I think that's where the Chat GPT is not going to help. Now, I haven't met, if anybody's an attorney, I'm sure that there may be a different opinion from your bias. So that's just a general comment from me.
No, it's a great point, Stan. And I can guarantee that nobody at OpenAI ever thought about whether or not, you know, non-lawyers should be able to write settlement agreements. All they did was just take a snapshot of the internet and then, you know, chewed it all up. And then this is what they got. I mean, there are plenty of examples of bias in these AIs. If you go to DALL-E or you go to some of these image generators and you say, give me a photo of lawyers discussing a case, 99% chance that picture is going to have white people in it. You know, like, I don't know. What if you're asking that question from Lagos? You know, why would that be white people? You know, like, but there are biases that are built into these data sets. So I do worry about that. And I think, you know, Bob's saying that the mediator is sort of the guardrails. You know, they can ensure that whatever content is generated is made relevant. That's an example of something, an LLM generating something I don't agree with. You know, I think non-lawyer mediators should be able, if they're trained, if they're experienced, to write settlement agreements. But you know, it's coming up with its impression based on just chewing all this data up. It's sort of a consensus opinion. So I don't know if other people think about that. I mean, Zev, you're an expert on debiasing data. I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we're going to tackle that moving forward.
Yeah, first of all, anyone can write a settlement agreement. As like, you know, I mean, I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law since 1999. You can copy and paste. It doesn't matter. Also, like, so it depends on what we mean by bias, right? So there's bias that is problematic from a legal perspective. There's bias that's problematic from a mathematical perspective. You know, suboptimal bias is different than just legal bias, and legal biases are orthogonal to questions of quality of models, right? So you can have a high quality model with no bias, you can have a low quality model full of bias, or vice versa, right? So you have to think of bias mitigation independently of quality of model generation. And the biggest problem I see is model drift. So oftentimes, even if you build a model that's not bad initially, models learn and change over time, and that's typically where you see the biggest problems of bias from a legal perspective creeping into most ML and AI applications that I've reviewed over the last, I don't know, 9-10 years.
Well, Zev also taught me something interesting about you know, confirmation bias, right? Like the thing, if you build an AI to predict the weather tomorrow, you know, tomorrow, is it sunny or does it rain? Like, you don't, if the AI says tomorrow it's going to rain and the next day it's sunny, well, it was wrong. But if you ask an LLM, what's the right outcome to this dispute, you never get that next day. You never get a chance to say, well, it turns out it was right. The prediction was right, because there's no objective truth. Now, Stan, when you ask an LLM, you know, should non-lawyer mediators write settlement agreements? And it says, no, only lawyers should write them. Well, you and I don't like that because we're non-lawyer mediators, you know, and so is it that we just think it's biased because we don't agree with it? But, you know, maybe it's taken a look at all of this data and chewed it up, and it thinks, well, actually, I think only lawyers should write settlement agreements, and maybe it has a valid reason as to why it's making that recommendation in the aggregate, not about you and me, but, you know, we take it personally because we're on the wrong side of its recommendation. So I think that's going to be a challenge too, when LLMs play more of this role. It's, if it agrees with me, it's right. And if it doesn't agree with me, then it's biased. And there are a lot of lawyers that would see that and say, well, it's right. You know, non-lawyers shouldn't write these agreements. They're going to screw everything up. Colin, what are you going to say?
Yeah, no, I mean, this has been quite fascinating, because when I started thinking about chatbot, I was thinking more of it, you know, like we see on many people's websites, that it was going to be going out to the public rather than helping the mediator. But one of the things that concerns me about ChatGPT, among many, is that we're expecting an answer and it's going to give us an answer, but we've no way of actually verifying the answer. And I had a really interesting experience. I've been playing with it. My son is actually on here as well. We produced this kind of bibliography of MedArt materials. I thought for fun, I run it through it and ask it to add to it. Well, it made stuff up left, right, and center. Okay, but it looked good. it used prominent people's names. It cited different journals. But I decided to check all the sites to see, and it was pretty much 60% made up, which is horrifying.
Yeah, that's the part that worries me. It's particularly in finding sources, you know, like what are the prominent books that talk about this topic, and it makes up all of this stuff left and right. But I do think that what Bob was saying too is if you had a long-term memory and you said these are the books in the field, right? And then you said to the LLM, I want you to use the data and the long-term memory to generate the bibliography. That's better than just going to OpenAI and saying, you know, who are the top experts in online dispute resolution and what books did they write, you know? Bob, were you
Yeah.
gonna say something?
Yeah, and I think that's why the architecture is the way it is, that you don't directly interface to LLMs. You need something before it, before you go out, either either your own training or specific references. And if they can't find anything within that context, then maybe you could look at wider context, but don't interface directly to them, is my advice.
And I would say, just to echo that, you know, a lot of what I see is not the most interesting uses of machine learning in the work that we do is not necessarily these large language models. I think the large language model is a little bit like icing on top of the cake, but you still got to bake the cake. You know, like in terms of figuring out what the right outcome or what the recommendation should be, just giving an LLM, you know, which is taking a snapshot of the internet and come up with its own correlations, and they're predicting each word in a series. That's not where you should get the recommendation about what the right outcome should be and how confident you are in that outcome. There should be some other mechanism that generates that, and then you use LLM essentially to generate the final document or put it into a statement that's intelligible, you know, to the user so they can read it and say, oh, okay, that's the right outcome. But I think we're talking about a series of different mechanisms working together. And then the LLM is just one aspect of synthesizing input, doing the processing to understand what the question is being asked, and then taking the results from all of this and then generating a document back that's intuitive and intelligible to the user. That's my guess. Ron, please.
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of times when we start injecting technology, it forces us to recognize we never measured anything with humans. And in this case, I think one of the issues is we don't do quality control on mediators, but we're demanding it of the software now. The issue here is mediation is typically taught as a process where you extract the agreement from the parties. And yet what we're talking about here is wanting the LLM model to come up with reasonable suggestions that we never require of a neutral in this case, and as opposed to, let's say, even in arbitration, we don't, so long as they listen to the data, the evidence, they get a free rein. What we're really talking about is looking at overall quality of mediation generally, which I think is great and overdue. But, you know, I just want to highlight we're holding the LLM models to a higher standard than we hold the mediators. So as with e-discovery, or even legal case search, we end up improving the process as we inject the efficiency because of how it was done in the past. And I'm very, very happy to hear that we might start looking at quality control of mediation more generally, and that these models are likely going to improve the outcomes. But I do want to highlight that we're holding it to a little bit of a higher standard. So I wanted a non-disclosure agreement, a one-way NDA, and I went to Bard and it generated something for me. I showed it to the person I wanted to work with. He's like, fine with me. And we were fine. Now, I mean, I happen to be a lawyer. I don't practice. That's fine. But if two people are trying to mediate, they go to an LLM model and they end up with something that both of them agree with. As far as we ever look at a human neutral, that would be absolutely fine because they both agreed to it and they walked away finished. And yet somehow we're worrying about outcome analysis here and fairness that we never inject in the process in mediation in the past.
Well, I agree with that. I'll say I've done mediations where the parties have come up with a resolution that I'm like, well, if it was up to me, that would not be the resolution I would suggest, but it's not up to me. You know, it's up to the parties to figure out what's going to work for them. So to evaluate a mediator and say, well, you know, this mediator is not very good because they've delivered unfair outcomes as evaluated by some third-party algorithm, It's like, well, that, it's like, how can you hold me responsible for the decisions that the parties reach themselves, So, but I think arbitration is a different ball of wax, right? When you have an arbitrator that's rendering a decision, I think it's interesting to have an algorithm come in, look at the same data, analyze it, and then have the algorithm say, okay, well, we think this is the appropriate outcome, and then this was what the human came up with, and then you can see what's the reason for the disparity. I don't think there's any objective criteria for what it should be, and you can have two people look at it and say, well, the human was right for one evaluator, and then the algorithm was more right for the other evaluator. But I do think that evaluating mediators on the effectiveness of mediators on the basis of some algorithm's assumption of what a fair outcome should be, that's unfair to the human mediator.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ron. I mean, look, if you read any of the books, by Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, we know humans are noisy to begin with, right? And all the tests all the examples they gave was giving 10 different judges the same evidence and got 20 different punishments, right? So, or you give 10 doctors the same symptoms, you get 10 different diagnoses, and so we can't hold the software or the models basically to a higher quality standard than humans would do anyway, right? So, and if you look at the amount of misinformation that's out on the internet, I mean, it's very difficult to set the right standard here, because there's nothing to measure a standard against, to be honest with you. And I tend to agree also, with Zev in the sense that all models tend to be wrong. Some are really interesting. That's about all you can conclude, basically.
All models tend to be wrong, and some are really interesting. Okay. Well, I also think, and again, I'm taking this back to ICODR, as we start to see more usage of AI and even potentially LLMs and some of these ODR mechanisms, I think it'd be very interesting to come up with a test suite. I put a link in earlier to a company I learned about from a New York Times story called Anthropic, and they're very focused on AI safety. And it's interesting, before their LLM, Claude, I think that's what it's called, before it responds to any queries, they give it a whole set of guardrails. They have all this stuff that they tell it. They even read it, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's almost like Asimov's laws of robotics. Don't say anything that's going to hurt someone. Don't say anything that's going to perpetuate bias. Like this, before you ever get to ask it a question, it's already been reminded of those priorities. And I think it'd be interesting for an ODR platform that integrates an LLM for us to have maybe another LLM that could come in and ask questions and test it, ask 1,000 questions and then evaluate its answers and see if any of those answers are worrisome. Because, I had a meeting with a compliance person from Intel the other day, and she's very interested in AI and dispute resolution. And she was saying, I think we need to certify the data sets that are used to train these AIs. And I was like, well, that's kind of hard to do, to go and say, well, you can't include this data, because then you're kind of putting your thumb on the scale. I was saying maybe it's better to, have certain set of questions, and we can come in and test these AIs and see if the responses that are generated raise any red flags. But I do think at some point we're going to need to have a way, and this is what Ron gets to, quality metrics to evaluate, these mechanisms, because they could easily be deployed in a way that introduces bias or compromises confidentiality or other kinds of things. So any last thoughts? I know we're at time here. Bob, I want to give you the last word, but does anybody have any last comments, questions? We need to meet more about this. I thought we were going to have all the answers by the end of the hour, but it looks like we have more questions than answers. So Bob, do you want to take us home? What are your final thoughts? Are you going to continue working on the support bot? You're excited by its potential?
Yeah, so we'll continue working on the support bot in terms of performance, and also like the conversation about guardrails but again, this is a long-term process, and it's because you're not dealing with just one specific jurisdiction or one set of ethics or one set of cultural values.
Mm-hmm.
Coming up with something that's going to be right for everything is nearly impossible.
That's right.
I mean, it's one thing to say, does this make sense within let's say, United States, but it may make absolutely no sense in another country.
That's
And
right.
so
That's right.
I'm not sure.
Well, can everybody give me a round of give Bob a round of applause to thank him for presenting to us today? Thank you, everyone. I will say tomorrow we're doing our mediate.com book club with the authors of a new book called The Legal Singularity. It's the same time and the same Zoom room, and they're actually going to be interviewed by ChatGPT. So that'll be interesting to see about their book. So feel free to join. It's open. But we'll do another meeting in August, and I think we're going to be talking more about this. So please, if you have any topics, I'll edit this recording down and share it with everyone. But boy, we're on the leading edge of it now. So we gotta figure out a lot of knotty questions. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Great to see you. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we'll talk soon.